You're listening to Stories from the Presbyterian Pew. This podcast is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to educating lay people in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, about PCA church government and process. On our website, we offer free, self-paced courses to help you understand the Book of Church Order, the BCO. These courses cover how the BCO works in theory, but what does it actually look like in practice? Stories from the Presbyterian Pew gives you an opportunity to hear directly from those who have walked through or observed what happens when the wheels of church process are set in motion. The stories we share are all true and all happened in PCA churches. All names and place names have been changed to protect the identities of the storytellers and others who play a role in their stories. Our goal is to facilitate understanding and awareness. Think of these stories as case studies, embodied and brought alive by the voices of our storytellers. Before we begin part 2 of Ashley's story, I want to share the definition of sexual harassment and sexual assault from the PCA's DASA, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Assault report. Sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination prohibited by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It consists of inappropriate verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature that has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's sense of well-being by creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive environment from the viewpoint of the affected individual. And sexual assault is any type of sexual behavior or contact where consent is not freely given or obtained. It is accomplished through force, intimidation, violence, coercion, manipulation, threat, deception, or abuse of authority. This story will mention these types of abuse and may not be suitable for little ears. Please keep in mind that while these definitions apply in any interaction between people, the abuse is even more heinous when perpetrated on a child by an adult, compounded further when that adult has a position of authority over the child, such as in a teacher-student relationship. So today we are joined again by our previous guest, Ashley. She is a woman who spent the formative years of her life in the PCA. Now, if you haven't already listened to part 1 of Ashley's story in the previous episode, you're going to want to go back and catch up on that because it really lays important groundwork and kind of the parallel stories that were happening in the background that lay the framework for this part 2 of her story. As we heard in part 1, Ashley experienced abuse from her father, who was later elected as an elder in her church, even after she disclosed that abuse to her pastor and to her shepherding elder. And Ashley had already experienced things that led her to believe that she would not be able to get help from the church. And then, with that in the background, a high school teacher, a teacher who had gained her trust, took advantage of that trust. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. Ashley is going to share that part of her story with us. So Ashley, jumping into the middle of your PCA experience, when did you begin going to the school that was connected to the church we're referring to as Redeemer Presbyterian? And what was your mom's connection to that school?
Yeah, we started attending there when I was in 3rd grade, and my mom became a teacher at the school. I loved the school. It was a great school. It challenged us academically, but it also helped deepen my love for God. And I'm not a person who thinks, because sometimes people hear Christian school and they think, oh, your family must fit this type of thinking or this mold. But I am not a person who thinks that everyone should homeschool or everyone should attend Christian school. There's definitely a place for public school. There are definitely situations where that is the best option, where that is needed. I am thankful that my parents sacrificed greatly to send me to this school. I still have connections with the school, although it's no longer connected with the PCA. And I just want to say that this story is not a reflection on the school as a whole. This part of my story is about one man who I view as a wolf, who was able to disguise himself as a shepherd for a really long time. And it is about one bad leader in the school outside of this teacher that did not last at the school for very long because he was a bad leader. So I do want to just put it out there. The school has safeguards in place. And at the time when I was in high school, sexual abuse was not something that was discussed as openly as it is today. Safeguards were not anywhere what they are today, regardless of the school that you. So that's not to make excuses or absolve everyone, but I know that now steps are taken in that school to be different from what happened at the time that I was there. So overall, it was a great experience. We were attending the Presbyterian church at the same time, and I really loved my teachers here, still love them, still have great relationships with many of them and connections with many of them. And if I saw them today, I would give them a big hug. A lot of my beliefs, a lot of who I am came from the people in this school.
And you explained to me as we were chatting once that when you were growing up, you didn't feel like you really fit the typical mold of what other girls your age were expected to do and enjoy and be interested in. What kinds of conversations and activities were you interested in?
Yeah, so I've never been the kind of girl who enjoys doing flower arrangements, although there's nothing wrong with it. I don't enjoy decorating as much outside of Christmas, of course. That's my exception. But I've never been into things that are maybe classic, girly, or feminine. I was very much attracted to theology, doctrine. I've really had a passion and a heart for that as far back as I can remember. And so I was attracted to conversations and activities around that. I also have a very mechanical focused mind. I love to see how things work and understand how they work. I would much rather fix my washing machine than hire someone to do it. Not just to save money, but it just feels empowering to me and accomplishing to me to be able to take care of those type of things. And I would much rather do that than figure out how the flowers should look in the vase. That makes no sense to me at all. I've never been very good with those types of things. So early on, I didn't feel that I met the mold, and it did set up this conflict, particularly in like strict reformed circles where I felt pressure, even if no one explicitly said it. I felt pressure to fit a certain mold. I did not enjoy women's Bible studies that needed to have frilly names, or the women's Bible studies seemed to be very focused on how we can set up our homes, which is not a bad thing, or how we can have good relationships with others, which again is not a bad thing. But in contrast, I was seeing like the men's group do deep dive on an entire book of the Bible. We're going to study First Timothy, and they go through it verse by verse. And the women got fluff, for lack of a better word. And I always just wanted to cut past the fluff. I didn't want to do any of the opening questions, which you have to be willing to do some of those icebreaking questions. But I didn't really desire children in the same way that others did. I did and I didn't. Like it was a different desire. And I don't quite know how to put words to that. But it was just always this feeling of I'm ever going to fit the mold that I'm being called to fit into. And that definitely set up another tug of war inside of me. I always wanted to listen to what the men were talking about and sit and talk politics and theology and all those things. I'd much rather do that than be in the kitchen hearing about the developmental stages of the children, all of the talk that the women were doing. And again, there's nothing wrong with it. It was just my personal preference and where I felt pulled.
So, as you're having these interests in these deeper conversations and study of theology, during your sophomore year of high school, you had a teacher who really seemed to recognize that you had those gifts and those interests. We're gonna call him John. So tell me a little bit about how you met John, and then what was his connection to Redeemer Presbyterian and then to the school.
Yeah, so I met John because he was working at Redeemer Presbyterian. At this time, I wasn't a member of the church, but the church and the school were on the same ground. So I was fully into high school at this point, and he was working for the church. He did different jobs, some office work, some accounting, and then later worked with like the Hispanic ministry that was there. So he did some teaching as well. But when I first met him, he was getting his doctorate at Westminster Theological Seminary. And he was doing that through correspondence. He was working on his dissertation at the time. And so they needed someone to come in and take a Bible class my sophomore year because the teacher who was doing it was just spread a little too thin. He didn't have the ability to do all of the classes. And they asked him if he would be willing to come in, and he did. And we did logic and reasoning, and that was a fascinating class. And I loved it. And yeah, he really did tap into a lot of the things that I was interested in. He asked a lot of really deep questions. We could go very deep with things, and it felt safe to explore ideas. And we talked about other religions of the world, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness. And he even had a Mormon who was not too much older than us come into our class one day and talk to us about what her experience was, what she believed, that kind of thing. And I loved the openness of that and was really attracted to it. So my sophomore year, he and I shared a lot of common beliefs, a lot of common interests. And I would, because my mom taught there, I would see him sometimes after school, and it would lead to him saying, "Oh, I found this article," or "I was reading a passage in this book," or "Oh, come, I want to show you something that I have in my office." And he lived in apartments right beside the church. So he was frequently on the grounds there. And I felt comfortable with him at the time, which I hate even saying now. And I have to work even now, even after all these years of therapy, to be gracious with myself and to be gracious to the teenage version of myself, because I didn't do anything wrong by feeling comfortable with him. But I wish that I hadn't felt comfortable with him in that year. And I wish that I hadn't started the rapport with him that I started. He would notice times when I was down. I was a really good student, and so I think it was harder sometimes for people to see some of the things that I was struggling with, because at the time I could balance things pretty well with what was going on at home and the different strife that was happening there. But he seemed to notice from that first year and started making comments about, "Are you okay? You doing okay? Are you sure? Is there anything I can do to help you?" Just throwing little things in here and there. He would notice when I got a haircut, even if it was just a trim, on dress down days, which is what we called them. It's the days where you didn't wear the school uniform. He would sometimes comment like, "Oh, that color looks really good on you." But for the most part, my sophomore year, it seemed and felt pretty benign. And looking back, I now know that it was predatory and I was being set up the whole time.
And I should have added this earlier in the questions, but About how old was John at this time? You were in high school and
He was in his mid 40s. Yeah. So I was about 15 when we first met, and he was in his mid 40s. Way older. Could have been my parent easily.
so you had him for Bible during your sophomore year, a lot of that logic and world religions discussion. During junior year, you didn't have him for a teacher, but you still saw him fairly regularly around the school. How did that take place? What were those interactions like?
Yeah, so it's similar to how my interactions were sophomore year after school. I would be there a little later because my mom was a teacher. I also was in student government, so there were sometimes things that I needed to go to the office for and talk with principals or secretaries or whoever I may need to make contact with about different things that were happening. And the school office and the church offices were separated by a hallway at this time. And so the church offices were on the right side and the school offices were on the left side. But doors were frequently left open to things like copy rooms. So you could see from the church office into the school office and vice versa. So we would cross paths there a little bit, not nearly as much as my sophomore year. So I definitely had more of a break from him, but it still had that familiarity grew in a way that I would say now the familiarity was inappropriate. It was on a level that it wasn't with any of my other teachers. He even started telling me that if I wanted to, I could call him by his first name, which I never would have done. All of my other teachers were Mr. last name, Mrs. last name. And I did not call him by John. I didn't go by that at the time. I only do that now as an adult. And I remember that feeling like, oh, that something about this doesn't feel right. It feels a little icky. And I started to get very few moments, like in my junior year, of this, something feels off. It was something about the way that he looked at me. And if you haven't been a survivor of sexual abuse or if you haven't worked with people who have survived it, it can be a difficult thing to describe. But it is a very distinct feeling that I have not had with any other adult. I wasn't someone walking around thinking that all adults were like this. But I just started to get little inklings of something not feeling right. But I thought maybe I just don't know what it's like to be with men that are really nice and he seems to care and what's my issue and blaming myself and shoving it down. So that was pretty much my junior year experience with him. We didn't have interactions inside of the classroom. He wasn't actually my teacher, and I did not know until the summer after my junior year that he would be coming back into the classroom for me. That's something that had happened over the summer. To me, he was just a guy that was taking my love of theology and doctrine seriously. And he would tell me things like, you are so mature for your age. And those are conclusions that I didn't reach until I was insert year in 30s or 40s or whatever. And he seemed to really value my opinion and would ask me how I felt about different articles or things that he was reading and wanted my input. And that meant a lot to me.
Okay, so then when you came to school for senior year, you once again you had John for a teacher, and he was actually your first period teacher. Tell us why it was significant that he was the teacher for your first period class.
Yeah, the way that the school was structured is that whoever you had for your first period, that is the room that you reported to when you came into school. And not everyone arrives at school at the same time. Because my mom was a teacher and we lived further away from the school, I didn't drive very frequently, even in my senior year on my own, just to save on gas because we were all going to the same place. And because she was a teacher, we got there early. So I would frequently arrive there before my classmates, a significant period of time before my classmates. And John started showing up earlier and earlier to the classroom, and we would have time to talk, just the two of us. And the familiarity increased exponentially in this year. Also, my class itself was smaller. It was about half the size that it had been in my sophomore year. So even inside of the classroom, the dynamics had changed and there was more one-on-one attention than there had been in my sophomore year.
And then you had shared with me that as your senior year progressed, there were more and more things that John did or said that were making you more and more uncomfortable. Can you tell me about, first of all, tell me about some of the things that he said during class?
Yeah, it could have been my naivete in my sophomore year because I did not know a lot about sexuality. I was very sheltered. And so it would not surprise me if there had been jokes that had gone over my head. But in my senior year, I noticed sexual innuendos, and even the ones that did go over my head, I noticed students reacting to them. And the majority of my classmates were female. There was only one male in my class. And I started to notice the other female students saying, "That's a really weird thing to say," like out loud to him. And instance that I will get pretty specific about because it is burned into not only my brain, but also in the brain of some of my other classmates. And we are more than 17 years out from this class, and they can still recall this. But I had a friend in the class, and we'll call her Anna. And one day, John wrote the word utopia on the board and said, "Who can tell me what this word means besides what Anna's husband will be living in?" And when I tell you that the classroom reacted, some girls, there were a couple of them that were very outspoken, that weren't afraid of authority, that immediately were reacting with, "You cannot be serious. I cannot believe you just said that." And I was like frozen. I looked at my friend. Her face was bright red. And although I didn't understand all of the implications of it then, I knew enough to know, okay, my body's not wrong when I'm getting weird vibes from him. Something is off. The problem was that he and I had been talking long enough that he had started to ask me more frequently if I was okay. I seemed depressed. And I had shared, not in detail, but I had shared that there were problems in my home and that my dad had an anger issue. I had shared enough that it would be a problem if he shared that information with anyone. And he had told me that it could be our secret, that he wouldn't share that with anyone, and that he was glad that I felt comfortable sharing that with him. And now, as an adult, I can't imagine telling a child that could be a secret between the two of us. I have worked with teenagers, and sometimes when I'm at church, I'll look around, and I'm not even as old as John was at the time, but I'll look around at the 15, 16, 17-year-olds in the congregation and think, I couldn't have said those things to them. They're kids. Like, it's so clear that they're kids. So I did not feel free to say anything as soon as these instances started happening. But he had dropped other things into the conversation, into the classes, into our conversations. He used to just compliment me when it was just the two of us. And then there was a shift where he started complimenting me in front of other students. And it even led to a point where he would say, when it was just the two of us, "You're going to make an incredible wife someday. Whoever the man is going to be lucky." And that makes me sick in my stomach. Even as I'm saying it now, you can still feel the same acid building up in your stomach and your body just wanting to run from that. It just makes you feel so gross. But then he started saying it in front of the class. Like any guy would be lucky to marry Ashley. I can't imagine saying that to a teenager, either male or female for me. But like for me, especially, I can't imagine looking at a 17-year-old boy and being like, guys, whoever marries him is going to be so lucky and he's so wise, and putting them on a pedestal above everyone else. And so I started pulling back a little bit, and I would hang out in different parts of the school when I wasn't really supposed to before class started. There was even a period of time where I would hide out in the bathroom until I could see that there were others in the classroom besides me, because all of our classrooms had a window cut into the door. So I would come out of the bathroom and walk down the hall and try to get the angle where I could look in and see that other people were going to be in that classroom besides just me. And I just started to try to pull back a little bit without fighting too hard, because I felt like he had an insurance policy against me now.
So through the fall, you're trying to avoid that period of time before first period where you were alone with him. But then in December, just before Christmas break, you asked your mom if you could actually start driving yourself to school so that you could skip first period altogether. And what was your mom's response to that?
Yeah, I started asking a couple of times if I could just miss first period. And my mom was really surprised by that, because Bible was always my favorite subject. And I had no problems in his class, none. My average never went below a 98 either year. And so that seemed odd to her, and rightly. And I'm so thankful that my mom picked up on that, because if she hadn't, things could have gotten much worse than they ever did. So she pressed in a little bit and asked, what's the real reason? What's really going on? And so I told her a little bit of what was happening, and I kept it not specific just to me and focusing on how I felt, but I also started to share that he was just telling things in class that were sexual innuendos. And I shared the particular incident about what happened with my friend Anna, because I thought that won't be about me. Maybe he won't tie me to it, and he could be put on warning and I can just get through my senior year. And so my mom rightly went to the principal and brought this to his attention. And I am guessing that this is going to be something that comes up in a lot of stories, because it does in other podcasts about abuse. But the principal decided to bring Matthew 18 into it and said that John had the right to address allegations made about him. And so without me being consulted, or really my mom having a choice, John was brought in and they talked to him. And so of course he knew it was me, because my mom was in there. And he was told specifically that he made me feel uncomfortable and that he was making other girls feel uncomfortable. And supposedly, I was not in the room, but I believe this. I believe that this happened, but he profusely became apologetic. And I am so sorry. I never meant to make her or anyone else feel uncomfortable. I view them like one of my nieces. He mentioned that he only ever wanted me to feel confident, and he in no way intended for me to feel uncomfortable, or he didn't mean anything by it, is what he said. And so the principal told him he would need to apologize to the class and it would need to be different going forward. So then I was called in to meet with the principal, and he told me about the meeting that had taken place. And he told me that John was going to have to apologize to the class the next day. And I was like, I don't think that's going to go well, because I knew John well enough at this time that I knew when John is faced with needing to correct something, if someone doesn't have authority over him, he reacts with anger. If they have authority over him, he acts with false, contrite attitude, and he still does that to this day. That is still his mode of operation. He will push back very heavily if you confront him and don't allow him to get by with whatever he's wanting to get by with. And so I expressed my concern that I didn't feel comfortable going into the classroom, that I was nervous that he knew that it was me. And so the principal assured both my mom and myself that he would be there in addition to John, and he would make sure that the apologies happened. For certain, the next day, I was not going to go in there until the last possible minute. And I walked in right before the bell rang, and they would do morning announcements in the first period. And I walk in, and John actually walks in not too long after me. He threw his books down on the table and was just like really in a huffy mood. You could tell he was angry, crossing his arms. And the principal doesn't come. And morning announcements finish, and he still doesn't come. And so John starts to talk, and I know I'm in trouble. And he starts with, I have been told to apologize to you guys. Of course, none of the other students know what has taken place. I'm terrified that they'll find out. I'm terrified that I'll be labeled as someone who's prudish or goody two-shoes or whatever it might be. So John starts, I've been told to apologize to you guys. And then he makes direct eye contact with me and says, but it's you guys who owe me the apology. And for the first time in my life, if you had known how timid I was back then, I like straight up went against what the authority was saying. And I needed to be out of that room. I wasn't going to stay in there for the full period. And I started gathering up my books, my notebook on my table, and I got my backpack. And John said, where are you going? And I didn't answer. And he said, you need to sit back down. And I looked right at him and said, no. And I walked out of the classroom and walked up to the office and waited in the principal's office for him to come. And when he came to his office, I said, where were you? You told me that you would be there. And I'm like shaking. I've been crying at this point because I've been out of the classroom. I'm away from John. And so all of the adrenaline and stuff is not as strong as it was when I had the courage to get everything up and leave. And the principal said, I have hundreds of students in this school that I'm responsible for, and other things come up. And John is a very godly man, and we're lucky that he wants to teach here. And you don't need to make a mountain out of a molehill. And he has apologized. He showed me that he understands that what we talked about was serious, and he's not going to do anything. And then the principal sent me back to class, and I went on to my next class. And so in that moment, I learned once again, you can't necessarily trust male leadership. It felt like a good old boys club yet again. There for each other. You're on the outside. And I'm sure all minors feel this way. And to some extent, there may be some men that always feel this way because maybe they're not seen as qualified to gain the powers of positions. But one thing I want to reiterate is for women, we know this will always be where we are. We will always be on the outside. I could never be part of their club. And this isn't a debate about whether men can be the only ones ordained or if women can. I don't really, I'll be honest with you, I don't care where you fall on that issue. Faithful Christians can land on both sides. But if you're going to land on the side where women cannot be ordained, it is your job to realize that there's a power differential. And it is your job to make it so that a person in authority doesn't have this excessive amount of power and control, and they're not able to be predators. Because let me tell you, predators, know how to spot the holes in your system. And there is a reason that predators choose conservative denominations to go into. Because if we're going to acknowledge that the Bible says that there are wolves in sheep's clothing, there are wolves masquerading as shepherds, we have to acknowledge they're going to come to us. And we can't assume that because someone has been to the quote right seminary or believes the right doctrine that they are good men. The demons know and they tremble, right? So if you're going to take parts of scripture that tell women, and you're going to say scripture is telling women that they can't do this, and you're going to hold to that interpretation, it is your responsibility to faithfully interpret the rest of scripture with it and realize that there is evil that's going to come in to those ordained positions. If you're a PCA elder, please hear me. Everyone that you're serving with in your presbytery is not a good man. John is still ordained. He's still ordained. So I know that not all men in that presbytery are good. You can't just vote for your guys because they can answer your questions about the Westminster Catechism. This kind of thinking that because they can recite correct doctrine to you makes them fit to be an elder has to stop. Because what happened to me would not have happened if people had asked questions, if people had pushed further, if people had pushed in on the character issues with John, the rest of the story that I'm about to tell you would not have happened if this principal had stopped and thought about it. So it's fine if you're going to interpret scripture that women can't be ordained, but that comes with extra responsibilities on your shoulder. And it is you who will answer. You've taken on these shepherding roles, and it's you guys who are going to answer for how you shepherd the souls of your people. So that wraps up what happened when John was confronted the first time. So what I learned was, again, can't trust that the right thing is going to happen and the right actions are going to be taken. And unfortunately, the lesson that John was taught was you can get away with things. You've taken the first step and now you can continue on because no one's going to hold you accountable. And John was in our classroom like it never happened. No one ever addressed me leaving the room. John and I never talked about it, but I definitely started pulling back more from him. And now I was in more danger because John knew that I was resistant. In addition, I realized that the principal was my mom's boss, and I didn't want my mom to get in trouble. And so I told my mom that everything was good. I realized she was under the same power structure that I was. So for my mom's knowledge at the time, everything had been resolved and she had done what she needed to do. So none of this falls on her at all.
So all of this happened right before Christmas break with this quote unquote apology and the principal not being there and not backing you up when you asked him why he hadn't been there. You went out on Christmas break, came back to school after the holidays, and then came a day in February when your class went out to breakfast. So tell us about that breakfast trip.
Yeah, so it was February 28th, 2006, and I can verify that's the correct date because it was the first time that IHOP had done their annual free half stack of pancakes if you gave a donation to help with, I believe it was children's literacy. So John arranged for our senior class to take us to breakfast. I had student government responsibilities that morning with a fundraiser that we were doing. And then by the time I got to class, everyone was packed up and ready to go, which we knew about ahead of time. And because I was helping, I had picked up breakfast that we were selling to parents and students. So I had driven my own car there. And I was driving more frequently myself at this point. And so as we were walking out the door, John said all of the other students could ride together with another student that had a large SUV and said, I'm going to ride with Ashley. And at this point, I didn't know what to do because I didn't want to get in a car alone with him. I knew that that wouldn't go well. But I had already been told, don't make a mountain out of a molehill. John is a godly guy. He wants what's best for you. I had been reprimanded for standing up previously. And I thought, it's February. I just have to get through my senior year. So we got into my car, and he was wearing his faded blue jeans and his black leather jacket. And we started to drive to IHOP. And I'm telling this story not to be graphic, but so that people can understand part of what sexual abuse is and that they can understand the consequences of not listening when somebody brings up the first warning signs. So we're driving in the car. I'm a fairly inexperienced driver at this point. I was very late in getting my license. So this was my first. I had only had my license for less than a year. It was the very beginning of me having a license. And so obviously I need to focus on the road. But I have John beside me, and he just starts talking away. And he asks me if I have a boyfriend. He starts to confirm that I don't have a boyfriend. He says, you don't have a boyfriend, do you? And I shared something that was true because I was very into at the time, which I do not believe this anymore, but I was very into the Joshua Harris kiss dating goodbye movement, the purity movement that was happening at the time. And so I said, I've decided not to date in high school. And John looked at me and said, I think that's really wise. I don't think that you need to be thinking about dating high school boys. You're so mature for your age. You should think about dating older men. Which, if I can pause here and say, that is very weird. It is very strange to tell a teenager in high school to start thinking about dating older men, because not just men, right? It wasn't this division of like men and boys. It was like high school boys and older men, which is the category that John fell into. Because again, he's mid 40s at this point. And I didn't respond because my mindset was, if women don't feed into the lust that men have, then it will stop. I viewed myself always as the brakes for anything that could transpire between men and women. I thought that was the job of women. Again, don't believe that anymore. I think it's the responsibility here was John's, because my mind was in no way headed that direction. And if you happen to be in a consensual relationship, which this could not be, but if you happen to be, it is not the job of one person. It is the job of two people to draw boundaries. And it is the job of both people to respect each other's boundaries. But I did not grow up understanding that. So in my mind at the time, I thought, if I just stay quiet, we're not that far from the restaurant. So I stayed quiet, and he takes it even a step further and says, you have the most beautiful eyes. And again, I stayed quiet. And one of the things that the principal had told me that I had neglected to mention earlier is that he had questioned whether or not I had a crush on John. And so that was playing in my mind in this whole episode. And I thought, okay, don't affirm anything. Don't build towards like you have a crush, which again, not my responsibility. I'm carrying far too much weight for anyone, let alone a 17-year-old alone in a car with a predator. And I stay silent. John is completely undeterred. And he said, did you know that? And so I responded with a simple thank you, and then tried to let the conversation die again. And he said, no, I mean it. You have the most beautiful eyes I have ever seen, and I could stare into them forever. That is clearly a statement of someone who has attraction, infatuation towards another person. You don't drop that into casual conversation. That is not the same as that sweater really makes your eyes pop, or that color looks really good on you. A way that, like, men can objectively notice that women are beautiful, and that's fine. Women can objectively notice that men are handsome, and that's fine. But this is specific romantic language, and it's not okay. And I went into absolute high alert at that point because it was clear he was totally undeterred by the conversation that had been had with the principal. And he was actually getting bolder. And I did not know what to do. And at that same time, his hand starts coming over towards my knee. Again, I'm driving a car. I'm limited with the power differential already. Now I'm even further limited because I'm operating a vehicle the same time that this is happening. And so all I could think was time seemed to slow down. And all I could think was, you have to stop him, you have to stop him, you have to stop him. And I did not use any type of profane language at this time. And so all I could think was, like, you just have to shock him. And so, with everything that I could muster, when his hand was literally hovering over my knees, I looked over at him and said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" And his eyes got so big, and his hand was frozen right over my knee. And he pulled his hand back and rested it on my gear shift, which again doesn't need to be there because he's not driving. So that's obviously not what he was reaching for. And he just responded with a one-word answer. He just said, "Nothing." And then he got angry and he was breathing really loudly, like almost huffing, looking out the window. And we got to IHOP, pulled in the parking lot. He got out, slammed his car door. I get out of mine, like shaking, like, what am I going to do? And I followed him in. And as soon as he opened the door, he started joking and laughing with the other students, like flipping this switch. And I thought, oh no, I've seen this before. I've seen this man who can blow up. So he actually is like dangerous because he can turn it off and on. He's more dangerous than I ever thought he could be. And so I quietly tell my friend Anna, "Don't let me ride back home with him alone." She's like, "You okay?" And I said, "Just don't let me ride with him alone." She didn't ask any other questions, never has to this day. It's just like we knew what was happening. And so when the breakfast was over, he said, "Okay, I'm going to take care of the bill. This was on me. You guys can go back. I'm going to ride with Ashley again." I make eye contact with my friend Anna. I discreetly hand her my car keys. She goes, gets in my car. He and I come out and he's, "Are you okay? You seem off. Are we okay? We seem off." And I said, "Yeah, no, we're fine. Why would we be off? We're fine." And we round the corner where he can then see my car. And he's been saying, like, "Okay, good, because I really wouldn't want anything to be wrong." Literally, we round the corner. He sees my car and he stops, like mid-sentence, and says, "What is Anna doing in the car? Why is she riding back with us?" And I said, "Oh, she just wanted to ride back with us. Is that a problem? I thought that would be cool." And I'm just trying to play it off. I'm trying to placate him. I'm trying not to say that he's done anything wrong because at this point, I just need to survive. And I'm just like, I'm never going to be alone with him again, and it's going to be fine. And he literally looks at me and says, "Do you feel like we need a chaperone?" And I'm like, okay, that is a weird answer. If you don't think anything should be off, if you don't think that anything that you did before was inappropriate, why are we using the word chaperone? Like, if it's not occurring to you that what you're saying could be taken as flirtation or sexual or however he wants to put it. It's sexual abuse. It's grooming. But however he wants to put it, if it's not that way, why would you use the word chaperone? Why are you bringing a courtship? Because you know that I believed in courtship at that time. Why are you bringing that language into it? So it was just more validation of, okay, you've got him. You know who he is now. You've got him pegged. And just said, no, like she wants to ride back with us. He got in the back of that car and again was like huffing, didn't say a word. The whole ride back to the school was super awkward. We got out, Anna and I go back to our next class. He goes off and we don't talk about it ever again. And I make sure I'm never alone with him. After that day, I never, for sure, never entered the classroom without without someone else being there. He tries to rekindle stuff. He tries to go back to this familiar relationship that we had, but I am just not budging this time. He starts asking me to stop by his office at the church. I am firmly, but you can just bring whatever it is to the next class. And he'll say, no, I've got this book that you would love. I've got this article you would love. And sometimes I agree to go and just don't show up. And other times I say, oh, why don't you just bring it tomorrow? I'm busy today. And it just became several weeks of me putting him off and continuing to try to placate him while also maintaining my boundaries, which is the most difficult thing I've ever done. It is very difficult to juggle a predator's ego and not letting them think that you're on to them while at the same time not putting yourself in a dangerous situation. So that's how things progressed for a few weeks anyway.
And then something happened at school that actually wasn't even directly related to you, but definitely impacted John and the whole dynamic there. What was the next event with John at school?
Yeah, so unbeknownst to me, I did not know this until years after the fact. All of the other girls in my class together, they had the same second period class, and I was in a different one. And so in their second period, they all went to the principal's office together to talk about John and how uncomfortable they were with him. I knew that a situation had happened that morning. He had failed a girl, which I will agree was unfair. She felt that it was unfair, lost her temper with him, which I am so thankful for because I don't know what my story would have been if that hadn't happened. So she wanted to go with her friends to explain to the principal what had happened. In this conversation, they all start talking about how they're uncomfortable with John. He makes them uncomfortable. They don't want to be in the class with him. And apparently there were also students in another class that he was teaching the same year. He was teaching the 10th grade again. And one of the girls in my class also had a sibling in that class. And so she knew that there were problems in that class as well. And so apparently questions were asked of both classes, although no one came back to me. I suppose the principal knew how I felt already or didn't particularly care, is the more sinister way of reading what happened. But either way, John was removed from the class in April, and we no longer had a teacher. The 10th grade got a replacement, and we started an independent study. We read the book Blue Like Jazz and had to write a paper on it. And then I was relieved because I thought everything was over with John and I wouldn't have to deal with him again. And John saw me outside of the office one day and cornered me without letting other people know that he was cornering me. And he said, yeah, obviously I'm not in your class anymore. Those girls don't know what they have done. And even though he's saying those girls, I know that it's also about me as well. And he said, yeah, the principal told them that they're going to be writing this paper and he's going to be grading it. But what they don't know is that he's giving me the papers to grade. And so I'm looking forward to reading y'all's final papers. And I was like very upset by this because it was going to be a big portion of our grade. Pretty much any grade that would be taken between April and the end of May when we graduated was hinging on this paper. That was it. And so I went and told my mom, and she immediately went to the principal and said that my grade better not be affected. And she did not want to find out that John graded my paper. And so as far as I know, John didn't grade my paper. But whatever the case was, I came out with a 99 in the class. No ill will fell against me anyway. And so then I thought it was done. Like, he's been removed. He knows not to come. And so I just focused on getting through and graduating high school.
So you told me that you have fairly clear memories from your high school baccalaureate, but not necessarily from your graduation. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I have a pretty clear memory of a lot of big events in my life, and I can remember them vividly. So, my baccalaureate, I remember very clearly. I remember that there was a teacher assigned to each student. They gave them sort of a charge. They prayed over us. It was a very spiritual thing, like sending us out into the world. Our English teacher had worked with another teacher in the school to pick a song that was sung to all of us, which was very sweet and special. And so I have a lot of memories of what happened at my baccalaureate ceremony. And I never understood until a few years ago why I could not remember large portions of my graduation ceremony. I was a salutatorian of my class, so I had to give a speech. And I do not remember anything after I walked onto the stage. I don't remember giving my speech at all. And then when I sit back down, I have pieces of the graduation. And then when I go up, I have no memory of going up and getting my diploma. I have no memory of turning my tassel. I have no memory of throwing the cap up in the air. I have no memory of walking out. And then once we get outside of the sanctuary, again, my memory is very vivid. And I can recall who was there, who I spoke to, what we said, gifts that were given, pictures that were taken, who I took pictures with. And a few years ago, I found a digital camera that had pictures from that time on it. And I started loading them on a computer to save them. And there were pictures from my graduation ceremony. And I realized that John was walking. I saw him in the background. And not only was he walking, but he was seated with the faculty, even though he wasn't teaching anymore. And he was seated directly behind me in the graduation. And so almost all of my pictures that my parents took during my graduation ceremony, because he was seated directly behind me. And it now makes sense why I have no memory of giving my speech. I have pictures of me giving my speech, but I have no memory of it because I would have been facing and looking at John. And I can't imagine how terrified I was back then. I think it says how terrified I was, the fact that I have no memory of it. So John stole a lot from me. And one of the last things he got was my graduation, the culmination of all of those years of work. And not just John, but the principal of the school. For him to let him walk in the ceremony there are a lot of things I want to say about that, but it's unconscionable. It's inexcusable. But it's just one action in a long line. And so when people ask, like, how does sexual abuse happen? How do these horrific stories happen? It happens by letting all of the seemingly little moments, like I've talked about, go by. And so this story, while it disempowered me at the time, and the experience was very disempowering, it empowered John. And the problem with not addressing sexual abuse is that the abusers are empowered by our inactions. The quote that I'm sure many of us have heard, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. The only amendment that I would make to that quote is all it takes for evil to flourish is for men who think that they are good to do nothing. Because if you do nothing, you are not good. Being a nice guy, and this is something that Boz Tavigian talks about, but being a nice guy is not what we strive for. Anybody can be nice. John was nice as long as he got what he wanted from me. And the minute that I pushed back, he was not. Niceness is manipulation. Kindness is a character trait, and you can tell the difference because if someone is not kind to someone else, although you can have firm boundaries, they won't totally change their character. But if you say no to a person and they immediately change how they speak to you, their demeanor immediately changes as soon as you say no. You know who they are. And that's how you expose wolves in sheep's clothing.
All I can say is amen. Amen. Just a reminder that predators and abusers are very charming to those who are useful to them. So people in power who are willing to overlook or ignore warning signs, who refuse to hold them accountable. Yes, of course, those people are going to find this abuser to be very pleasant and very charming because they are contributing to his ability to have access to what he wants to have access to. So there's no reason for him to be anything but charming. And unfortunately, it's the most vulnerable, like Ashley, who do have to set boundaries for their own survival and protection, who are the ones to first see, like what you said, Ashley, just that switch. Oh, now I know he's dangerous because he can turn it off and turn it on. So you had shared at the end of your last episode, I love the Mr. Rogers quote about looking for helpers. And at the end of our last episode, you reminded and exhorted us that, yes, sometimes help can come from within the PCA or from within whatever your local church context is, but sometimes that help comes from other places. And you specifically shared with me about your experience at community college, which is not a church-based or a religious place, and yet that's a place where you really found some things that helped you along your journey and your processing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I had the privilege of taking a psychology class and also a sociology class at this community college that was, like you said, not religious. It was connected with the state. And I'm really grateful, although religious institutions have their place and Christian schools can be great. I am glad for my own story that I did not choose to go to one because it helped me separate from that religious language and heal a little bit. So, one of the extra credit opportunities that was offered to us in the first couple weeks of the semester was to attend the No Means No conversation and panel that the college was putting on. And I didn't know how I was going to fare in the psychology class and the semester, so I thought might as well take out advantage of this. And I went in thinking, I don't have anything to learn here. I don't need this because I'm not dating. I'm courting. And so I won't need anything that they have to offer, but I can just go and sit with these people who are broken, who don't know how to interact with life properly. So it was a very arrogant attitude, but nonetheless, I went and I'm glad I did. And they started talking about things that I had not heard explicitly. They started using words like consent, sexual abuse, sexual assault. And for the very first time, I heard that you could be sexually abused without having technical intercourse, which I did not realize before. And I started to realize that I had been groomed and that I had been sexually abused. I still struggled to accept it because I thought of that as being the secular world. I'm still a part of the church, like we talked about in the last episode, that was very focused on like biblical counseling and seeking spiritual answers for all of your problems. And so I was very wary of what they called psychobabble in the church. But for the first time, something resonated with me. And I did not have the same feeling when people talked about biblical counseling and things like that. I didn't have the same connection with it. It didn't help. It wasn't helping me. Something was wrong. I knew something was wrong and I needed help. I was struggling with an eating disorder at the time that had only been exacerbated through the entire process. And one of the grooming things that John had done was when I was talking to him enough or doing things that he liked, he would compliment me both physically and like my mental capabilities. But when he did not like what I was doing, he would criticize people who were overweight, which I was struggling with. And he one time made a direct comment towards mine, but most of the time cased it in men find this unattractive. And it was just a control thing, but it got into my head and was affecting how I went through the world. And so at this event that the college was putting on, they talked about how the link between abuse and eating disorders. And I was like, okay, that's something the church has never given me a talk about. And this is something that I don't see how the Bible's going to help that. I can't seem to overcome it. And so I started talking to a counselor at the college, and it did not end up disclosing the sexual abuse, but started talking more about the home environment and my eating disorder. And that really started to help because I no longer felt like I could go to church leaders either about John or what was happening at home. I had learned too many lessons at that point. So, like Mr. Rogers says, I started looking for the helpers. And I think that it's a very sad commentary on the church that the majority of my helpers came from outside. And I don't think that's a problem with me or a problem with my thinking, as has been indicated to me. I don't think it's a problem with me not being open with people or me being liberal or whatever word you might attach to it. I think it is a direct reflection of how male leadership interacted and failed me over and over again.
Yes, Albert Einstein says that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. So when you've had multiple experiences of going to church leadership and finding best case scenario, no help at all, and worst case scenario, things that actually exacerbate the abuse or can communicate to your abuser that nothing will be done and empower him to abuse further, it just sounds like sanity to not continue to try the same avenues that repeatedly brought harm. And you're absolutely right. It's a terrible commentary on the church. And I wish I could say that your situation was an anomaly, but we know, statistically speaking, that even Christians who've reached out to the church for help often list church at the bottom of the list of where they found helpful, even below the category of other.
Yeah.
But thank God for helpers that come from all kinds of places, including your secular community college and a psychology class.
Yeah. And one of my hopes is that with podcasts like this one and others like it, that it won't just be what some have accused it of, like causing people to leave the faith. I don't think that's going to cause people to leave the faith. I think the people that were going to leave the church were already going to leave without this conversation happening. But with this conversation happening, I'm hoping that it brings the language that was lacking when I was 17, 18, 19, 20, the language that was lacking in the church at the time. I'm hopeful that it will bring it into it and that we can work to preserve the peace and the purity of the church. Real peace, real purity, not whitewashing the outside, not pretending, not faking that we have created a utopia, but actual peace and purity. Because I fully believe if we work towards the peace and purity of the church and we have that, is what changes the world, not working towards positions of power, not gaining all the authority that you can gain. The world will be changed when those who identify themselves as Christians are truly conformed to the image of Christ and live that out. And if they don't do that, if we continue to fake, if we continue to hide abuse, we harm not only the church, but the world around us. And that is not okay. And it has no place with having God's name attached to it, or Jesus's name attached to it, or the Holy Spirit attached to it, because they have no part in abuse. They have no part in the cover-up of abuse, and they will not stand for it forever. Justice comes in this life and in the life to come.
Amen. Amen. Ashley, thank you for sharing with us over these past 2 episodes. You've now brought us up to speed on these 2 parallel aspects of your life that just heartbreakingly were overlapping and intertwined with each other. The abuse that you experienced at home and at school, response of church leaders or school leaders in both of these situations. And you shared that your father has passed. So in a sense, there's some closure there, although that's not something that's ever over. But unfortunately, your crossing paths with John was not over at this point in your story, although there was a bit of a respite. So Ashley is going to be back with us in the next episode to talk about her experience with the PC as an adult in church. And unfortunately, John is going to come back into that part of her story. So thank you, Ashley, for once again sharing your wisdom and the insight that you've learned through these 2 experiences that we would never wish on anyone.
Thank you, Lena, for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Stories from the Presbyterian Pew is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit. We are 100% volunteer run and 100% donor supported. We want to keep this podcast ad-free, but in order to do that, we need the financial support of listeners like you. To make a one-time or recurring contribution, please visit presbyterianpew.org/donate. If you are interested in learning more about the governing document of the PCA, the Book of Church Order, please check out our free self-paced courses at presbyterianpew.org/courses. And if you have a question about PCA church government or something you have experienced in a PCA church, you can reach out through the form on our website at presbyterianpew.org/contact. Towards hope and healing, I'm Lena Sutherland with Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew.